At the family meeting, I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I did not stand up and list everything I had quietly endured for 32 years inside that house. I sat at the far end of the dining table in my mother's Greenwich home, hands folded, while she told the room, told her attorney, told my brother, told my sister and her almost ex-husband that I was the poor one, that I had never contributed, that the Sullivan estate, the properties, the accounts my grandfather had spent 40 years building, had no place in them for me. I did not argue. I did not even unpack the bag I had brought for the weekend. What my mother did not know, what none of them knew, was that the deed to every single property they were dividing that afternoon had been quietly, legally, irrevocably in my name for 3 years. Then someone knocked on the door. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. And hit like and subscribe if you have ever been written off by the people who were supposed to protect you and had to protect yourself instead. My name is Erin Sullivan. I am 32 years old, and for most of my life, I was the one in my family that no one quite knew what to do with, not in a dramatic way. Not in a way that would have been obvious to anyone standing outside looking in. The Sullivan home in Greenwich was beautiful. A white colonial with black shutters, a long driveway lined with oak trees that turned the color of rust every October. My mother kept it immaculate. She kept everything immaculate. The furniture, the holiday table settings, the story she told about our family at church and at the country club, and at every dinner party she hosted between September and December. The story went like this. Derek was the successful one. Derek had his MBA from Wharton at 26, his first investment property at 28, his name in the local business journal at 30. My mother kept the clippings in a leather folder she did not try very hard to hide. Cassandra, Cassie's, had made what my mother called a smart match. She married Edward Park when she was 29, a man whose family owned 3 hotels along the Connecticut shoreline. My mother said his name at dinner parties, the way some people say the name of a city they have visited and want you to know they have visited. And then there was me, Erin, who had gone to law school, which was fine, my mother said, practical, but who had chosen to specialize in estate planning and trust law, which was not the kind of law that made for good conversation at cocktail hours. Erin, who lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Boston and drove a 4-year-old Volvo and had not brought a boyfriend home since Thanksgiving of 2019. Erin, who showed up at Christmas with a good bottle of wine and left 2 days later without incident. I was not the black sheep. Black sheep cause scenes. I was something quieter than that. I was the one they had simply stopped trying to understand. My grandfather understood me. Thomas Sullivan was 78 when he died, and he was the only person in that family who had ever asked me what I actually did at work. Not in the polite, vague way my mother asked, "And how is the law firm, sweetheart?" but specifically, he wanted to know how trusts worked. He wanted to know what happened when a family disagreed about a will. He wanted to know what the law could do and what it could not do, and he listened to my answers the way people listen when they are not just being polite. I should have understood sooner what those conversations meant. In hindsight, I think part of me did. What I knew about my family by the time I was 30 was this. There were 2 sets of rules operating in the Sullivan house, and they had been operating for as long as I could remember. The first set applied to Derek and Cassie. These rules said that their mistakes were investments, their failures were temporary, and their needs were legitimate. When Derek's first real estate deal lost $200,000 in 2019, my mother called it a learning experience and helped him restructure. When Cassie's marriage to Edward started quietly unraveling, something the rest of the family pretended not to notice. My mother made sure Cassie had a divorce attorney on retainer before Cassie had even told anyone there was a problem. The second set of rules applied to me. These said that my stability was something to be taken for granted, my silence was agreement, and my presence at family events was expected, but my input was not. I had bought my own car. I had paid off my own student loans, $94,000 over 6 years, without telling anyone, because no one had asked. I had built a career that most people in my field respected, at a firm that handled some of the most complex estate cases in New England. None of that appeared in my mother's leather folder. I had spent 6 years by that point, helping families protect what they had built. I had sat across from elderly clients who were frightened about what would happen to their assets after they were gone. I had watched families implode over wills, over perceived slights written into legal language, over money that was never really about money. I understood trusts the way a mechanic understands an engine. Not just what it does, but why it works, and exactly what happens when someone tries to force it to do something it was not built for. I understood deed. I understood irrevocable instruments. I understood exactly what a signature, executed correctly and registered with the right court, could mean 20 years after the fact. My grandfather knew that too. He had watched Derek make promises and miss payments. He had watched Cassie position herself near his chair at every holiday dinner and ask about the Hamptons house with the kind of casual frequency that is not casual at all. He had watched my mother manage the narrative of the Sullivan family with the precision of someone who had been doing it for 40 years and intended to keep doing it, and he had called me 3 years before he died on a Tuesday afternoon in October and asked me to come to his office on Saturday. Not the house, his office, downtown. He said he had something he needed to handle, and he needed someone he could trust. I did not know then that that Saturday would change everything. But I am getting ahead of myself. Before I tell you about that afternoon, you need to understand what happened at my grandfather's funeral. Because that is where my mother showed me, in front of 47 people, exactly who she had decided I was. And that is where this story really begins. My grandfather died on a Thursday in February, at 6:14 in the morning, in the bedroom of the Hamptons house he had owned since 1987. He had been declining for about 8 months. Slowly, then quickly, the way those things go. His heart. His doctor had told him in June that the next winter would be difficult, and my grandfather had nodded, thanked the man, and driven himself to his attorney's office the following Monday. I know this because James Whitmore told me later. My grandfather did not tell anyone else. I flew down from Boston the morning after he passed. I did not call ahead. I just booked the first available flight, packed a bag, and went. When I arrived at the Greenwich house, Derek was already there with his girlfriend. Cassie was there with Edward, who stood near the kitchen counter looking at his phone. My mother was at the dining room table with a yellow legal pad and a pen, and she had already written 3 columns of notes. She looked up when I walked in. She said, "Good, you're here." Then she looked back down at her legal pad. The funeral was that Saturday. St. Michael's, the Episcopal church my grandfather had attended for 30 years. The pews were full. Neighbors, former colleagues, men he had played golf with since the 1980s. My grandfather had been well liked in a genuine way, not in the way that is performed. People told real stories about him at the reception afterward. I stood near the window and listened to all of them. My mother gave the eulogy. It was well written, and she delivered it well. She talked about Thomas Sullivan as a father, a businessman, a man of integrity. She did not mention that he had called me 12 times in the last year of his life. She did not mention the Saturday afternoons I had spent driving down from Boston to sit with him on the back porch of the Hamptons house while he told me about the properties he had bought in the Six Dies for almost nothing and watched become worth more than he had ever expected. She did not mention any of that because she did not know about it. She had never asked. The reception was held at the country club. White tablecloths, past hors d'oeuvre, a bar that opened at noon because my mother had decided grief was better managed with good Chardonnay. I was standing near the fireplace with a glass of water when my mother's friend Diane approached me and said very warmly, very sincerely, that I must have been so close to Thomas because he always spoke so highly of me. I said thank you. Across the room my mother had heard. I watched her register Diane's words. I watched something shift behind her eyes, not grief, something sharper than that. She excused herself from the conversation she was in and walked toward us, and she touched Diane's arm and smiled, and she said, "Thomas always said Erin was the responsible one." She paused just long enough. "But responsible doesn't mean entitled." Diane laughed, a little awkwardly, the way people laugh when they are not sure whether something was a joke. I did not react. I took a sip of my water. I looked at the fireplace. Derek, who had been standing 4 feet away and heard every word, smiled into his drink. Cassie was across the room. She met my eyes for just a moment. Then she looked away. That sentence followed me for the rest of the afternoon. I turned it over while I ate, while I shook hands with people I barely knew, while I helped carry leftover food to my mother's car in the parking lot at 4 p.m. because no one else offered. Responsible doesn't mean entitled. It was precisely constructed. It was designed to land in front of witnesses, to establish a narrative before any formal conversation about the estate had even begun. My mother was good at that. She had been building cases her entire life without ever setting foot in a courtroom. I drove back to the Greenwich house, changed out of my black dress, folded it into my bag. I told my mother I had an early flight. She said, "Of course you do," not unkindly, just matter-of-factly, the way you might comment on the weather. I kissed her cheek. I said goodbye to Derek and Cassie. I drove to the airport in the dark and sat at the gate for 2 hours because I had left far earlier than I needed to. I did not cry in the car. I did not cry at the gate. I did not cry on the plane. I thought about my grandfather. I thought about a Saturday afternoon 3 years before, in his downtown office, when he had pushed a folder across his desk toward me and said, quietly, "I need you to do this right. I need it done properly, so it cannot be undone." I thought about the documents I had drafted, the language I had chosen with the kind of care I gave to my most important clients. I thought about the notary, the filing number, the date stamp from the Connecticut court. I thought about what my mother did not know. By the time the plane landed in Boston, something in me had gone very still, not numb, still. The way a room goes still before something significant happens in it. I had been patient for 3 years. I could be patient a little longer. I just needed to wait for them to make their move. The weeks after my grandfather's funeral had a particular texture to them. Back in Boston, my life looked exactly as it always had. I was in the office by 8. I reviewed trust documents, advised clients, attended depositions. I ate lunch at my desk 3 days out of 5. I called my grandfather's old number once, by accident, on a Tuesday evening, out of habit, and sat with the silence on the other end for a long moment before I hung up, in Greenwich. Things moved faster. Derek called me 11 days after the funeral, not to check on me. He opened with, "So I've been talking to Mom about the estate," the way someone opens a conversation when they have already decided how it ends. He told me that the family was thinking about retaining Harold Kemp, an estate attorney who had handled some of my grandfather's earlier business matters, to manage the transition. He said Harold was old school but reliable. He said the process would be straightforward. I asked him what he meant by straightforward. He said, "Well, there's the Hamptons house, the 2 Greenwich rentals, the investment accounts. Mom thinks it makes sense to consolidate and move quickly." He paused. "The market's good right now for the Hamptons property." I said I understood. I did not tell him that Harold Kemp would find exactly nothing to manage. I did not tell him that the Hamptons house, the 2 Greenwich rental properties, and the investment accounts totaling $4.2 million had been held inside an irrevocable living trust for 3 years, registered with the Connecticut Probate Court, with my name as sole trustee and sole beneficiary. I did not tell him any of that. I said I would be in touch, and I hung up. 3 days later, my mother changed the locks on the Hamptons house. I found out because the property management company, which my grandfather had used for 30 years and which had my contact information on file as his designated representative, sent me an automated notification that new keys had been issued without the standard authorization form. I read the email at my kitchen counter on a Wednesday morning, standing up, still in my coat. I read it twice. Then I forwarded it to James Whitmore with a one-line note. Filing this. The week after that, Derek brought 2 men to the Greenwich rental on Orchard Street. A neighbor I had never met emailed me. She had found my contact information through the property management company and told me that 2 men with clipboards had been walking through the backyard and taking photographs of the foundation. She said one of them had a business card from a commercial real estate brokerage in Stamford. I thanked her. I told her I would handle it. I printed her email and added it to the folder I had been building since the day after the funeral. There was a quality to those weeks that I can only describe as a held breath. My family was moving quickly, confidently, in the way people move when they believe the ground beneath them is solid. They had no reason to think otherwise. As far as they knew, my grandfather had died and left an estate, and estates got divided, and the person with the most leverage at the table walked away with the most. That was the only law they understood. They did not know the other kind. It was during this time that I made a decision that I had been turning over since before my grandfather's funeral. Since, if I am honest, the afternoon 3 years earlier, when I had sat across from him in his downtown office and watched him sign his name to documents that would shape everything that came after. He had said to me, before I left that day, "Don't use this until you have to, Erin. Let them show you who they are first. Then you'll know it's time." I had thought about that sentence a great deal in 3 years. I had thought about it at Christmas dinners, and at the funeral, and in the car on the way to the airport afterward. I had been watching, the way he asked me to, and what I had seen, the emails, the changed locks, the men with clipboards, the phone call from Derek, the sentence my mother had constructed so carefully in front of Diane at the reception, had told me everything I needed to know. They had shown me. It was time. I called James Whitmore on a Friday evening in March, 5 weeks after the funeral. He picked up on the second ring. I told him I was ready. He said he had been expecting my call. We spoke for 40 minutes, and by the end of the conversation we had a plan. James would send formal notice to Harold Kemp and to my mother that an irrevocable trust instrument existed and had been registered with the Connecticut Probate Court. He would provide the filing number, the execution date, and the full list of assets covered. He would request that all transactions involving the listed properties cease immediately, pending review. But before he sent that notice, I wanted one more thing. I wanted them in a room. I wanted my mother to call the meeting herself, the way she always called meetings, on her terms, in her house, with her version of the story already written on her yellow legal pad. I wanted Derek there with his plans, and Cassie there with her silence, and Harold Kemp there with his old files. I wanted them to be completely certain, right up until the moment the door opened, that they had already won, because there is a difference between stopping something and letting it finish. My grandfather had taught me that too, so I told James, wait. Give it 2 weeks. She'll call the meeting. She always does. He said, and if she doesn't? I said, she will. My mother called me the following Tuesday. She said she thought it would be good for the family to sit down together properly, to discuss the estate in an organized way. She said she had spoken with Harold and that he thought a formal family meeting would be the right next step. She said she hoped I could drive down that Sunday. I told her I would be there. I hung up, sat down at my kitchen table, and for the first time in 5 weeks, I let out a long, slow breath. Then I texted James Whitmore 4 words. Sunday. Bring the file. I need to take you back 3 years, back to a Saturday in October, when the trees along the post road were turning, and the air had that particular New England chill that arrives in the second week of the month and does not leave until April. I had driven down from Boston the night before and slept in my old bedroom at the Greenwich house, in the full-size bed with the white comforter that my mother had not changed since I left for college. She had been out when I arrived. She had left a note on the kitchen counter that said food in the fridge and nothing else. My grandfather had called me 2 days before. He had asked me to meet him at his office downtown, not the house. He said 10 o'clock Saturday. He said to come alone. He said, and I remember this exactly, because he said it twice. Don't mention this to your mother. I had been practicing law for 4 years at that point. I was 39 days away from making senior associate. I had worked on 41 trust and estate cases, ranging from straightforward single property transfers to a particularly complicated multi-generational family trust that had taken 14 months and 2 mediators to resolve. I was good at my job. I was precise and careful, and I did not make mistakes on documents. Because in estate law, a mistake on a document is not a typo. It is a lawsuit. It is a family destroyed. It is a judge deciding in 6 minutes what someone spent 40 years building. I knew all of this when I walked into my grandfather's office that Saturday morning. He was already there when I arrived. He was sitting behind his desk in his good navy suit, the one he wore to church and to meetings he considered important. There was a pot of coffee on the credenza and 2 cups already set out. There was a manila folder on the desk in front of him, closed, with nothing written on the tab. He stood when I came in. He shook my hand. My grandfather always shook hands, even with family. He said it kept things clear. We sat. He poured the coffee. He asked about the drive. He asked about the firm. Then he folded his hands on top of the manila folder and looked at me the way he looked at things he had already decided. He said, I know what your mother will do the moment I'm gone. I did not say anything. I wrapped my hands around the coffee cup. He said, Derek owes money he hasn't told anyone about. I know because his accountant is an old friend of mine, and old friends talk. He's going to need to sell something the moment he legally can. He paused. The Hamptons house is the most valuable thing I own. I said, how much does he owe? He said, enough that the house wouldn't cover it. I looked at the folder. He said, Cassie is going to leave Edward. She hasn't told anyone yet, but it's coming. And when it does, she's going to need an asset that isn't marital property. She's going to reach for whatever she can get her hands on first. I said, the Greenwich rentals, he said. Yes, he opened the folder then. He pushed it across the desk toward me. Inside were handwritten notes, his handwriting, small and precise, and a set of printed reference documents I recognized immediately. Trust templates, Connecticut specific. The kind I worked with every week, he said. I want to set up an irrevocable living trust. I want to transfer the Hamptons property, both Greenwich rentals and the investment accounts into it. I want you named as sole trustee and sole beneficiary. He looked at me steadily. I want it done correctly so that when the time comes there is nothing to argue about. No ambiguity, no room. I understood what he was asking, not just as a granddaughter. As a charity. An irrevocable living trust, properly executed and registered, cannot be contested the way a will can. A will goes through probate. Probate is public. Probate is slow. Probate is a room full of people with competing claims and a judge who has to sort through all of them. A trust bypasses all of that. Once the assets are inside it, they belong to the trust. The grantor no longer owns them. There is nothing to divide because there is nothing in the estate. I told him I understood. He said, "Can you draft it?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Will you?" I looked at him across the desk. He was 75 years old. He had built everything in that folder from nothing, from a single hardware store in Bridgeport in 1971 that he had worked 18-hour days to keep solvent. He had put 3 children through college. He had maintained a house in Greenwich and a property in the Hamptons and 2 rental units that he managed himself until he was past 70, because he did not trust other people with things he had worked that hard for. And he was sitting across from me in his good Navy suit asking me to protect it. I said, "Yes, I'll draft it." We spent 4 hours in that office. I took notes. I asked every question I would have asked a client. I was meticulous, because he deserved meticulous. By 2 o'clock, I had a complete outline. I told him I would have the full draft to him within 10 days. He said that was fine. He walked me to the door and shook my hand again. Then he said, "Don't use this until you have to. Let them show you who they are first." I drove back to Boston that evening. I worked on the draft for 6 days straight, reviewing every clause, every asset description, every legal reference. I sent it to him on day 7. He reviewed it, made 2 minor notes, and sent it back. I incorporated his changes, printed the final version, and drove back to Greenwich on a Thursday evening 2 weeks later. We executed the documents at James Whitmore's office. James was a colleague I trusted completely. A partner at a firm in Hartford, my grandfather signed. James notarized. I filed the registration with the Connecticut Probate Court myself, standing at the clerk's window, watching the date stamp come down on the cover page. November 14th, 3 years, 4 months and 6 days before my mother sat at the head of her dining room table and told a room full of people that I had no place in the Sullivan estate. I filed it myself. I had drafted every word of it. I knew every clause, every asset, every legal implication of every sentence. I knew exactly what I was signing, and I knew exactly what it meant when James Whitmore texted me at 8:47 that Sunday morning, 23 minutes before I was due at my mother's house, and said simply, "I'm 5 minutes out." Files in hand, I put my phone in my coat pocket. I picked up my keys. I drove to Greenwich in the quiet of a Sunday morning, parked in my mother's driveway behind Derek's Range Rover, and sat in my car for exactly 90 seconds. Then I walked inside. The calls started 4 days after the funeral and did not stop for 6 weeks. My mother called on a Monday. She said she wanted to discuss logistics. That was the word she used. Logistics. As though the Sullivan estate were a catering order that needed to be sorted before the weekend. She said Harold Kemp had looked over the preliminary paperwork and that things were fairly straightforward. She said she hoped I would be cooperative. I said I would be in touch. She called again Thursday. This time she said she had spoken with Derek and that the family had agreed the Hamptons house should be listed by spring if possible. She said the market was favorable. She said she wanted everyone on the same page before Harold filed anything with the court. I said I understood. She called the following Monday and Tuesday and did not leave messages either time. Then Derek called. It was a Wednesday evening. I was at my kitchen counter, eating leftovers and reading a brief when my phone lit up with his name. I almost did not answer. I did, because I wanted to hear what he would say when he thought he had the advantage. He opened pleasantly. He asked how I was doing. He said Boston winters were brutal. Wasn't that right? And I agreed that they were. Then he said he had been thinking about the estate, and he wanted to be upfront with me about something. He said the family thought it was best to move efficiently. He said there were carrying costs on the properties, taxes, insurance, maintenance, and that holding them idle wasn't practical. He said Harold had estimated the Hamptons house at $2.3 million in the current market. Then he said, "We thought it would be fair to set aside $50,000 for you, for your portion." Given everything, I set down my fork. Given everything. 2 words doing an enormous amount of work. Given everything meant, given that you are the one we have decided matters least. Given that your silence has always been your agreement. Given that $50,000 is a number large enough to seem generous and small enough to ensure you stay exactly where we have always put you. The 2 Greenwich rentals alone generated $8,400 a month in combined rent. I had drafted those numbers into the trust document myself. I said, "I'll think about it, Derek," he said. "Don't think too long. Harold wants to move before April." I said goodnight and ended the call. 2 days later, an email arrived from Derek's personal account. 3 paragraphs, formal, in the way that people write formal when they want something in writing but do not want to involve an attorney yet. It outlined the $50, zero offer. It used the phrase, "in recognition of your relationship with the family," twice. It asked me to respond within 10 business days. I forwarded it to James with the subject line, "Add to file." Then Cassie called. Cassie and I had never been close. Not in the way sisters in movies are close. The late-night phone calls and shared secrets, kind of close. We were cordial. We showed up to the same events and spoke warmly enough that no one outside the family would have noticed anything. But Cassie had always aligned herself with wherever the warmth in the family was concentrated, and the warmth had never been concentrated anywhere near me. She called on a Friday afternoon. She asked how I was holding up. I told her I was fine. She said she missed Grandpa, and I believed her. She had genuinely liked him, even if her affection had always contained a degree of calculation. Then she said, "Erin, I just want you to think about what's best for the family right now. Mom is stressed. Derek is stressed. We all are. And I think if you could just be reasonable about this, we could get through it without things getting messy," I said. "What do you mean by reasonable, Cassie?" she said. "Just, you never really cared about money. You've always been fine on your own. Derek needs this more than you do right now, honestly. And Mom just wants things settled," I said. "I hear you," she said. "So you'll sign?" I said, "I hear you, Cassie." There was a pause. She said, "Okay," in a tone that meant she had already decided I was being difficult. I did not respond to Derek's email. I did not call my mother back. I did not sign anything. Instead, I drove to Hartford on a Saturday morning and spent 3 hours with James going through every document in the file. We reviewed the trust instrument line by line. We confirmed the registration date, the asset list, the filing number. We reviewed Connecticut trust law regarding irrevocable instruments and the 3-year window for creditor challenges, which had already passed. We looked at Derek's email, the property management notifications, the neighbor's account of the men with clipboards at the Orchard Street rental. James said, "They've given us a paper trail," I said. "I know," he said. "When do you want to move?" I thought about my grandfather sitting across from me in his good Navy suit. I thought about what he had said, "Let them show you who they are first." They had shown me. My mother with her logistics and her coordinated silence, Derek with his $50,000 and his April deadline, Cassie with her reasonableness that was really just a different delivery system for the same message. "You do not belong here, Erin. You never have. Now sign paper and go." I looked at James across the table. I said, "Not yet. I want them to call the meeting first. I want them to walk in thinking it's already over." James nodded slowly. He had been a litigator for 22 years before he moved to estate law. He understood the value of timing. He understood that how something ends is shaped entirely by what happens in the moments just before. He said, "That's a clean play," I said. "My grandfather taught me." I drove back to Boston that evening as the sun went down over the highway. I thought about the Sunday that was coming. The dining room table, the yellow legal pad, Harold Kemp with his old files and his outdated assumptions. I thought about my mother's voice saying responsible doesn't mean entitled to Diane at the country club reception, that careful sentence, those 4 words she had been building her whole life. I thought about what 4 words of my own might sound like, in the right room, at the right moment, not yet. But soon, the escalation when it came was not subtle. Derek filed a petition with the Connecticut Probate Court on a Thursday morning in late March. I found out because the court sent a notification to the address listed on the trust registration, my Boston apartment, and because James called me 20 minutes after I received it, having gotten his own copy through the court's attorney notification system. The petition claimed that Thomas Sullivan had died intestate with respect to certain real property assets, and that the estate required formal administration. It listed the Hamptons house, both Greenwich rentals, and the investment accounts by approximate value. It requested the court appoint an administrator. It did not mention the trust, because Derek did not know the trust existed. James said, "He's filed blind. His attorney didn't do a title search," I said. "Harold Kemp didn't do one either," James said. "No, he didn't." There was a particular quality to that moment. Sitting at my desk in Boston, reading a legal filing that described assets I had possessed for 3 years as though they were unclaimed, available, up for division. It should have made me angry. It did not. It made me feel something closer to clarity. Derek had just handed me documented proof that he had attempted to initiate probate proceedings on assets he had no legal claim to. His attorney had filed with the court without conducting basic due diligence. Every document in that petition was now part of the public record. I printed it. I added it to the folder. Then my mother came to my apartment. She did not call first. She drove up from Greenwich on a Saturday morning, 4 hours in her silver Mercedes alone, and knocked on my door at 11:45. I knew it was her because my building has a video intercom, and I watched her on the screen for a moment before I buzzed her in. She was wearing her camel coat, the good one. She had done her hair. She had come prepared. I made tea. I set out 2 cups on the kitchen table. I did not tell her to sit down. She sat on her own, the way she always occupied rooms, as though she had arranged them herself. She said, "I'm going to be direct with you, Erin," I said. "Please." She said the family was moving forward with the estate. She said Harold had filed the necessary paperwork. She said Derek had spoken with a real estate agent about the Hamptons house, and that there was already interest from a buyer in Westchester. She said she understood that this might feel unfair to me, but that the practical reality was that the properties needed to be managed by people who were in a position to manage them. Then she said, "I need you to stop ignoring Derek's emails." I poured the tea. She said, "The $50,000 offer is fair, Erin. More than fair given," she paused, just briefly, "given that you've never been involved in any of this." I looked at her across the table. She was 62 years old, and she had been building this sentence her entire life. She genuinely believed it. That was the thing I had understood for years, and still found hard to sit with. She was not performing. She had constructed a version of reality in which I was peripheral, decorative, manageable, and she had lived inside that version for so long that it had become simply true to her. I said, "I hear what you're saying, Mom," she said. "Then you'll respond to Derek?" I said. "I'll be at the family meeting on Sunday." She looked at me. Something moved across her face, not quite surprise, more like recalibration. She had come here expecting resistance or tears or negotiation. She had not expected simple agreement. She said, "Good, that's all I'm asking." She finished her tea. She put on her coat. She kissed my cheek at the door and said she would see me Sunday and to drive carefully on the highway. I closed the door. I stood in my hallway for a moment. Then I went to my desk, opened my laptop, and drafted the email I had been composing in my head for 6 weeks. It went to James. It said, "Sunday is confirmed. Full meeting, full family, Harold Kemp present. I want you there by 11. Park down the street and wait for my text." He replied within 4 minutes, "Understood. I'll have certified copies of everything." I closed laptop. I went to bed early that night. I slept better than I had in 2 months. The week before the meeting had its own particular rhythm. I went to work. I reviewed documents. I had lunch with a colleague on Wednesday who asked if everything was all right, and I said yes, just some family business I was sorting out. She said family things were always complicated. I agreed that they were. On Thursday evening, I drove to Hartford and spent 2 hours with James doing a final review of everything we would bring on Sunday. Certified copy of the trust instrument, certified copy of the court registration, title search results confirming the trust's ownership of all 3 properties, account statements showing the investment funds held in the trust, Derek's probate petition, the emails, the property management notifications, the neighbor's account of the men with clipboards, 47 pages organized, tabbed in a dark blue file folder with the Sullivan family trust number printed on the cover. James said, "This is airtight," I said. "It was always airtight." That was the point. He said, "Are you ready for what happens in that room?" I thought about it, honestly. I thought about my mother's face and Derek's voice and Cassie's silence. I thought about Harold Kemp opening a file he had built on faulty assumptions and realizing in real time that every assumption was wrong. I thought about the particular kind of quiet that falls over a room when people understand, all at once, that the ground has shifted beneath them, and they cannot get it back. I said. Yes, he said. Then I'll see you Sunday. I drove home in the dark. I ironed my clothes for the meeting: charcoal trousers, cream blouse, the navy blazers I wore to court. I laid them out on the chair in my bedroom. I set my alarm for 7. I thought about what my grandfather had said in his office that October morning, 3 years and 4 months ago. Let them show you who they are first. Then you'll know it's time. He had been right. He had known them better than any of them had ever known themselves. I turned off the light. Sunday was 4 days away. Sunday arrived the way significant days sometimes do. Quietly, without ceremony, the sky outside my window a flat pale gray that could not decide whether it wanted to rain. I was up at 6:50, 10 minutes before my alarm. I made coffee, stood at my kitchen window, watched a neighbor walk his dog along the street below. The city was slow on Sunday mornings. I liked that about it. I had always liked things that moved at a considered pace. I showered, I dressed, charcoal trousers, cream blouse, the navy blazer. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for a moment, not out of vanity, more the way you look at something before a long trip to make sure you have not forgotten anything. I had not forgotten anything. I texted James at 8:47 on my way. ETA 10:45. He replied, already in Hartford. Files is with me. I'll wait for your text. I drove south on 95 in the thin morning light. The highway was quiet. I passed the exit for New Haven and thought, as I sometimes did, about my first year of law school, the apartment I had rented for $780 a month, the library where I had spent most of my waking hours, the professor who had told me in my second semester that I had a gift for precision, and that precision was rarer than people thought. I had held on to that. Precision had carried me a long way. I pulled into my mother's driveway at 10:49. Derek's Range Rover was already there. Cassie's white Lexus was parked behind it. There was a third car I did not recognize, a dark green Buick, older model, the kind of car that belonged to a man who had been practicing law since before I was born. Harold Kemp. I sat in my car for 90 seconds. I had told myself 90 seconds, and I kept to it. Then I went inside. The dining room had been arranged with intention. My mother had set the table the way she set it for important occasions, the good chairs pulled in, a carafe of water and glasses at the center, legal pads and pens at each place. She was standing near the window when I came in, wearing a dark green wool dress, her reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She looked composed and purposeful, the way she always looked when she had organized something. Derek was at the far end of the table. He had a leather portfolio open in front of him and a cup of coffee at his elbow. He nodded at me when I sat down. He did not smile. Cassie was beside him. She was wearing gray, her hair pulled back. She glanced at me when I came in, and then looked at her hands. Edward was not there. The divorce, quiet as it had been, was apparently quiet enough now that his presence was no longer considered appropriate. Harold Kemp was at the corner of the table nearest the window. He was a small, neat man in his 70s, white-haired, with the careful posture of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms and boardrooms and had decided long ago that stillness conveyed authority. He had a brown accordion file on the table in front of him, held shut with a rubber band. He looked up when I sat down and gave me a brief, professional nod. My mother took her seat at the head of the table. She said, "Thank you all for being here. I know this isn't easy, but I think it's important for the family to handle this together. In an organized way, the way your grandfather would have wanted." She paused. She looked around the table. She let that settle. Then she said, "Harold has reviewed the estate and prepared a preliminary distribution framework. I'd like him to walk us through it, and then we can discuss." Harold removed the rubber band from his accordion file. He opened it. He produced a set of stapled documents, 4 copies, one for each of us. He slid them across the table with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this many times. I looked at mine without picking it up. It listed the Hamptons property, both Greenwich rentals, the investment accounts. Beside each asset was a proposed distribution, Derek's name, Cassie's name, and at the bottom, a line that read Erin Sullivan. Ex gratia payment $50,000 in full settlement of any claim. In full settlement of any claim. I set the document down. My mother said, "I hope we can all approach this reasonably," and, Derek said, "I think it's pretty clear." "Harold, walk us through the timeline for the Hamptons listing." Harold opened his mouth, and then he stopped. He was looking at his own copy of the document, but his eyes had gone somewhere else. He reached into his accordion file and produced a second, smaller folder. He opened it. He looked at something inside. He closed it. He opened it again. The room noticed. My mother said, "Harold?" Harold looked up. He looked at me. Then he looked at my mother. He said slowly and carefully, the way careful men deliver information they wish they did not have to deliver. "Patricia, before we proceed, I need to ask." He paused. "Has anyone in this family spoken with Erin's attorney?" The room went very still. My mother said, "Erin doesn't have." She stopped. She looked at me. "Do you have an attorney?" I did not answer. Derek said, "What is this about, Harold?" Harold said, "When I filed the preliminary probate inquiry last week, I ran a standard title search on the Hamptons property." He set the smaller folder flat on the table. "The property is not in Thomas Sullivan's estate. It has not been in his estate for 3 years." He looked around the table. "Neither are the Greenwich rentals. Neither are the investment accounts," Cassie said. "What?" Harold said. "They are held inside an irrevocable living trust, executed November 14th, 3 years ago. Registered with the Connecticut Probate Court." He looked at me steadily. "The sole trustee and sole beneficiary of that trust is Erin." The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence. Not the silence of an empty room. The silence of a room full of people who have just understood something they cannot take back. Derek stared at the folder in front of Harold. His jaw was tight. He was doing the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was not working. Cassie had gone very still in her chair. She was looking at the table. My mother was looking at me. Her face had not collapsed. She was too composed for that. But something behind her eyes had shifted in a way I had never seen before. A kind of recalibration that was happening in real time. The slow-motion recognition that the version of reality she had been operating inside for 6 weeks was not the actual version. She said, "Erin, just my name." Nothing after it, and then someone knocked on the door. I picked up my phone. I sent one word to James Whitmore. Now the knock came again. 2 clean wraps, unhurried. My mother did not move. Derek looked at the door, then at me. I stood up from the table, walked to the front hall, and opened the door myself. James Whitmore was standing on the porch in his gray overcoat, a dark blue file folder under his arm. He was 51 years old, silver at the temples, with the kind of face that courtrooms had made patient and unreadable. He had driven 40 minutes from Hartford on a Sunday morning, and he looked as composed as if he had simply stepped out for a walk. He said, "Erin." I said, "Thank you for coming." I stepped aside. He came in. I walked him to the dining room doorway, and then I stepped back and let him enter first. The way you let something settle before you follow it in. He walked to the table. He set the dark blue folder down in the empty space beside Harold Kemp's accordion file. He looked around the room, at Derek, at Cassie, at my mother, at Harold, with the measured, courteous attention of someone who has entered a room and immediately understood its geometry. Then he said, "Good morning. My name is James Whitmore. I'm a partner at Whitmore and Associates in Hartford. I represent Erin Sullivan in her capacity as sole trustee of the Thomas A. Sullivan Irrevocable Living Trust." He opened the folder. He produced 4 certified copies of the trust instrument, the court registration, and the full title search results for all 3 properties. He set one copy in front of each person at the table with the same calm efficiency Harold had used 20 minutes earlier, except that Harold's documents had been built on an assumption that no longer existed, and James's documents were built on a foundation that had been registered with the state of Connecticut for 3 years and 4 months. He said, "The Sullivan Family Irrevocable Living Trust was executed on November 14th, 3 years ago, by Thomas Arthur Sullivan as grantor. It was notarized, witnessed, and filed with the Connecticut Probate Court on that date. The filing number is on the cover page of the document in front of you." He paused. "All assets listed in the trust: the Hamptons property at Further Lane, the Greenwich rental at Orchard Street, the Greenwich rental at Maple Ridge Road, and the investment accounts held at Fidelity and Vanguard totaling $4.2 million, transferred to the trust at execution and have remained there continuously since that date. They did not pass through Thomas Sullivan's estate at his death because they were not part of his estate at his death." The room was absolutely silent. Harold Kemp was reading his copy of the trust instrument with the focused, slightly pained expression of a man recognizing, line by line, that every assumption underlying 6 weeks of his work was wrong. Derek had not touched his copy. He was staring at James with the look of someone whose mind is working very fast and not arriving anywhere useful. Cassie had picked hers up. She was reading the first page with a careful blankness that I recognized as the face she used when she was frightened and did not want anyone to know. My mother had not looked at her copy. She was looking at me. I had not sat back down. I was standing near the doorway, my hands at my sides, my weight even. I met her eyes. She said, "You did this," not a question, a statement, and underneath it, something I had not heard in my mother's voice in a very long time, something that was not quite accusation, not quite grief. Something closer to the sound of a story she had been telling herself, discovering that it had a different ending than she had written. I said, "Grandpa asked me to," she said. "He didn't tell me." I said, "No, he didn't," Derek said. This can't be enforceable. There has to be a capacity argument. He was 75, James said without raising his voice. Thomas Sullivan was examined by his physician in September of the year the trust was executed and declared to be in full cognitive health. That documentation is in the appendix. Tab C. He turned one page of his copy. The trust was executed 14 months before his first cardiac event and 37 months before his death. The 3-year window for any creditor or third-party challenge under Connecticut trust law has passed. There is no viable capacity argument, Derek said. There's undue influence. She's an estate attorney. She drafted it herself. That's a conflict of interest, James said. Thomas Sullivan retained independent counsel, myself, to review and co-execute the trust instrument. My role and signature are documented on page 11. The trust was Erin's work as a professional, completed at the request of her client, who happened to be her grandfather. Courts have consistently held that family relationship does not constitute undue influence absent evidence of coercion or diminished capacity. You have neither. Derek closed his portfolio. He opened it again. He looked at the document. He said, $50 million, $4.2 million in accounts, 2 rentals, the Hamptons house. He just gave her everything? I said, he built everything. It was his to give. Derek looked at me. His face had gone through several versions of itself in the last 4 minutes. Disbelief, calculation, anger, and now something that was almost grief. Not for my grandfather, but for the version of the future he had been spending for 6 weeks. He said, "I needed that house, Erin." I said, "I know," he said. "You knew this whole time." I said, "Yes," he said, "and you sat there, at Christmas, at the funeral. You let us," I said. "You filed a probate petition on property you didn't own, Derek. You offered me $50,000 for assets worth more than $4 million. You sent men with clipboards to a rental property that belonged to me to plan a sale that was never going to happen." I paused. "I let you show me who you were." "You did." Cassie made a sound that was not quite a word. My mother had not moved. She was still looking at me, and her face had settled into something I did not have a name for. Not anger, not the sharp, managed expression she used when she was winning. Something older than that. Something that might have been, if I allowed myself the thought, the beginning of understanding that she had made a very long mistake about a very specific person, and that the mistake was permanent now. Harold Kemp quietly gathered his documents and put them back into his accordion file. James said, "I'll be sending formal notice to Derek's probate attorney today, requesting withdrawal of the petition. I'd ask that all parties refrain from any further action regarding the listed properties. Any communication regarding the trust going forward should come through my office." He closed his folder. He looked around the room one more time. He said, "I appreciate your time." Then he looked at me and gave a small, precise nod. I nodded back. He picked up his folder and walked out of the dining room and down the hall and out of the front door. I heard it close quietly behind him. The room was very still. Outside, a car started. The sound of it pulling away down the driveway came through the window, clear in the Sunday morning quiet. No one spoke. I picked up my coat from the back of my chair. I folded it over my arm. I looked at the table, at the 4 certified copies lying in front of 4 people who had spent 6 weeks dividing something that had never been theirs to divide, and I felt something release in my chest that I had been holding for a very long time. I looked at my mother. She was still sitting at the head of the table. Her hands were folded in front of her, the way she always folded them when she was composing herself. She looked smaller than she had when I walked in. Not physically. Something else. I said, "I'll be in touch through James's office about the transition of the property management accounts." She said nothing. I said, "Take care of yourself, Mom." I walked out of the dining room, down the hall, past the coat rack where my grandfather's old wax jacket still hung, the one he wore for walks in the fall, the one my mother had not taken down in 8 months. I touched the sleeve briefly as I passed. Then I opened the front door and walked out into the gray Sunday morning. My car was the last one in the driveway. I got in. I set my coat on the passenger seat. I started the engine. I did not look back at the house. I pulled out of the driveway and drove. Derek called his attorney from the driveway before I had even reached the end of the street. I know this because James told me afterward. Derek's attorney called James's office at 11:53 that Sunday morning, while James was still 40 minutes from Hartford. The attorney's name was Mitchell Crane, a litigator out of Stamford who had handled Derek's real estate disputes before, and who apparently believed, based on the 30-minute briefing Derek gave him in the front seat of a Range Rover in our mother's driveway, that there was something worth fighting. There was not. Mitchell Crane was a competent attorney. He requested a full copy of the trust documentation, which James provided the following morning. He reviewed it for 4 days. On Thursday, he called James back and said, professionally and without elaboration, that he had advised his client the petition was not worth pursuing. Derek's probate filing was formally withdrawn from the Connecticut court on a Friday, 11 days after the family meeting. I was in a deposition when the notification came through. I read it on my phone during a recess, standing in a corridor outside a conference room on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Boston, and I felt nothing dramatic. Just the quiet satisfaction of a document behaving exactly as it was designed to behave. What I did not feel, for the first time in a very long time, was the low-grade vigilance that had lived somewhere behind my sternum for 6 weeks. The constant, careful readiness. It was gone. I noticed its absence the way you notice the absence of a sound you have grown so used to that you stopped hearing it. Only when it stops do you realize how constant it was. The legal proceedings, such as they were, ended quickly. Derek's petition was gone. Harold Kemp sent a brief formal letter to James acknowledging the trust and withdrawing from any further involvement in the estate. It was 3 sentences, professional and final, but the other things, the things that happen in families, the slower, messier things, those took longer. Cassie called me on a Tuesday, 10 days after the meeting. I almost did not answer. I did, because I thought she deserved the chance to say whatever she had decided to say. She said, "I owe you an apology." I said, "Okay." She said, "I knew Mom was. I knew she wasn't being fair to you. I've known for a long time. I just didn't. I didn't want to make things harder for myself." She paused. "That's not an excuse. I know it's not." I said, "No, it isn't," she said. "I'm sorry." Erin, I believed her. Cassie had never been cruel the way Derek could be cruel, or the way my mother could be cruel. She had been something quieter and in some ways more damaging. She had been absent. She had stood in rooms where things were happening to me and looked the other way consistently for 30 years, because looking was costly and she had decided early that the cost was too high. I said, "I hear you, Cassie." She said, "Is there? Can we?" I said, "I don't know yet. Give me some time." She said, "Okay." She did not push. That was something Derek did not call. He sent an email 3 weeks after the meeting that was 4 paragraphs long and managed the considerable feat of simultaneously expressing injury, assigning blame, and requesting money without ever once using the word apology. He said the family was in a difficult position. He said he had obligations he could not meet without some form of liquidity event. He said he hoped I would consider making a good faith gesture toward family unity. I read it twice. I forwarded it to James with a one-line note. No response required. My mother did not call for 14 months. The first weeks after the meeting had a different quality than the weeks before it. Before, there had been tension with a shape, a point it was building toward, a Sunday morning I was moving toward. After, there was just the ordinary texture of my life, which turned out to be quite enough. I worked. I advised clients. I had dinner with a friend from law school on a Thursday evening and told her, in broad strokes, what had happened, and she listened and then said, "You held that for 3 years?" I said yes. She said, "How?" I said I had learned it from my grandfather. She raised her glass to him. In May, 6 weeks after the meeting, I drove to the Hamptons house for the first time since my grandfather's funeral. I let myself in with the key that had always been on my keychain. The property management company had sent my mother's new keys back after James's formal notice, and the original keys, the ones my grandfather had cut for me during one of my Saturday visits, had been mine all along. I walked through the room slowly. The furniture was the same. The photographs on the mantel were the same. There was a coffee mug on the kitchen counter that had been there since February, the morning my grandfather had made himself breakfast for the last time. I washed it. I put it away. I sat on the back porch for a long time. The weather was good, that clean, salt-edged May air that the Hamptons does better than anywhere else I know. I thought about my grandfather sitting in this same chair, looking at this same yard, telling me about the hardware store in Bridgeport in 1971. I thought about the Saturday morning in his office. I thought about the way he had shaken my hand at the door and said, "Let them show you who they are first." He had been 75 years old and he had understood everything. I stayed at the house that weekend. I walked on the beach on Saturday morning. I called no one. I slept well. In June, Derek's financial situation became public in the way that financial situations eventually become public, through a combination of court filings, a failed refinancing, and a story in the Stamford Business Journal that was careful in its language but clear in its implications. His investment partnership had been carrying significant debt for 2 years. Without a liquidity event, the Hamptons house, specifically, the structure had become untenable. I read the article once. I did not feel satisfaction exactly, something more complicated than that. Derek was my brother. He had been unkind to me in specific and consistent ways for 30 years, and he had tried to take something that was not his, and he had failed. Those things were all true simultaneously. I was not going to pretend otherwise in either direction. His partnership filed for restructuring in August. He moved out of his Westport house in October and into a rental in Fairfield. He did not contact me during any of this. Cassie finalized her divorce from Edward in September. She had found an apartment in New Haven. She texted me occasionally, not often, not intrusively but steadily. A photo of her new kitchen, a question about a restaurant I had recommended once. Small things. I replied to most of them. We were building something cautious and slow, and I was willing to see what it became. My mother called on a Wednesday evening in late autumn. 14 months after the family meeting, I was at home. I saw her name on the screen and I sat with it for 3 rings. Then I answered. She said, "Erin," I said. "Mom." There was a pause. Not the composed, strategic pause she used in rooms she had organized. A different kind. The pause of someone who has rehearsed something and is now uncertain whether any of it applies. She said, "I've been thinking about what happened." I said, "I know." She said, "I didn't. I didn't know your grandfather had done that." I said, "I know you didn't," she said. "I want you to know that another pause. I think I wasn't fair to you." For a long time, it was not an apology. It was a sentence constructed around an apology, shaped like one from a distance, with the actual word left out. My mother had spent 62 years building a particular kind of precision, and that precision did not easily accommodate direct admission. I understood that. I did not need her to be different than she was. I said, "I know, Mom," she said. "I would like, if you're willing, I'd like to have dinner sometime." I said, "I'll think about it." She said, "That's fair." We said goodnight. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter and looked out the window at the city below. The lights were on in the apartments across the street. Someone was cooking dinner. Someone was watching television. The ordinary life of a city going about its evening. I thought about my grandfather's office, the coffee, the manila folder, the handshake at the door. Then I thought about something he had also said, something I had not thought about as often as the other things. "Erin, the point was never to punish them. The point was to make sure they couldn't take what wasn't theirs." He had been right about that too. 18 months after the family meeting, I opened my own firm. It was not a dramatic decision. It did not happen in a single moment of clarity. It built slowly, the way most real decisions build. Through accumulation, through the gradual recognition that something you have been thinking about abstractly has become something you are ready to do concretely. I had been at Hargrove and Associates for 7 years. I was good there, I was respected there, but I had been thinking, for longer than I could precisely name, about a practice that was built around a specific kind of client, people like my grandfather, people who had built something real, who understood that the wrong document or the wrong silence could undo decades of work, and who needed someone who took that seriously. I named the firm Thomas Sullivan Law. James Whitmore helped me set it up. He referred 3 clients in the first month, people whose cases required the kind of careful, precise estate work that had always been what I did best. By the end of the first year, I had 14 active clients and a small office on Commonwealth Avenue in Boston with 2 windows that faced west and caught the afternoon light. I thought about my grandfather every time I unlocked that door. The Hamptons house I kept. I drove down 4 or 5 times a year, long weekends mostly, the kind where I woke up early and walked on the beach before anyone else was out, and then came back and made coffee and sat on the back porch with a book I was only partially reading. The house was easy to be in. It smelled the same as it always had: salt air and old wood, and something faintly like the cedar closets my grandfather had kept his good suits in. I had not changed much about it. I was not in a hurry to. The 2 Greenwich rentals I kept in the trust and continued to lease. The same families who had been renting from the property management company for years stayed on. The rent covered the carrying costs on the Hamptons house, and then some. My grandfather had bought both properties in the early 90s for what now seemed like figures from a different world, and they had quietly, steadily appreciated into something significant. He had understood that patient investments were the only kind worth making. He had understood a lot of things: the investment accounts I managed carefully, the way he had managed them. Not aggressively, not passively, but with the kind of attention that does not require constant action. I met with a financial advisor twice a year. I made adjustments when they were warranted. I did not touch the principal. Derek's partnership completed its restructuring in the spring of the following year. The process was long and public, and reduced what he had built over a decade to something considerably smaller. He was not ruined. Derek was resilient in the specific way that people who have always expected rescue are resilient, because the expectation itself functions as a kind of floor. He found investors. He downsized. He moved forward. He called me once during this period. It was a Sunday afternoon in February, 2 years after the family meeting. He said he was calling to check in. We talked for 11 minutes about nothing of consequence. The weather, a restaurant in New Haven that Cassie had recommended to both of us, a news story about Connecticut real estate that we had both apparently read. At the end of the call, he said, carefully, "I think I handled things badly," I said. "Yes, you did," he said. "I'm not sure I would have done differently at the time." I thought that was probably true, and I respected him more for saying it than I would have if he had offered a cleaner version. I said, "I know," he said. "Okay," we said goodbye. We had spoken 3 times since then. Not warmly, not coldly. Carefully, with the measured civility of 2 people who share a history and are deciding, incrementally, what to do with it. Cassie and I had dinner in New Haven in March, at the restaurant she had texted me about. She was living alone for the first time in her adult life, and she seemed unexpectedly lighter for it. She had taken a job at a nonprofit in New Haven that worked with housing access. Something, she said, she had wanted to do for years and had kept putting off. She looked genuinely well. We split a bottle of wine and talked for 3 hours. And at the end of the evening, she hugged me outside the restaurant, on a cold street, and said, "I'm sorry it took this long." I said, "Me too." I meant it. My mother and I had dinner in December, 14 months after her phone call. We met at a restaurant in Greenwich, neutral ground, a place neither of us had history with. She was dressed carefully, the way she always dressed carefully. She had aged in the 2 years since the family meeting, not dramatically, but genuinely, in the way that people age when the story they have been telling about themselves requires revision. We ate. We talked about the restaurant, about the winter, about a book she had been reading. We did not talk about the family meeting. We did not talk about the trust. We did not talk about what she had said to Diane at the country club reception, that sentence she had built so carefully: responsible doesn't mean entitled. Those things were part of the record now. They did not need to be relitigated over sea bass. At the end of the evening, she looked at me across the table and said, "Your grandfather was right about you." I said, "What did he say?" She said, "He told me once, years ago, when you were still in law school. He said, 'Patricia, Erin is the one who will do what needs to be done when the time comes.'" She looked at her wine glass. I didn't understand what he meant. I think I didn't want to. I looked at her. 63 years old, my mother, in her camel coat and her reading glasses on their chain, sitting across from me in a restaurant in Greenwich on a December evening, telling me that my grandfather had seen me clearly 30 years before she had. I said, "He saw a lot of things clearly." She said, "Yes, he did." We paid the bill. We walked out together. In the parking lot, she hugged me, briefly, correctly, the way my mother hugged, which had always been more posture than warmth, but was, I had come to understand, what she had. She said, "Same time next month?" I said, "Call me." She nodded. She got in her car. I drove home through the December dark, past the exit for New Haven, past the lit windows of the ordinary towns along the highway, through the long, quiet stretch before the city where the sky opened up and the lights of Boston appeared on the horizon, familiar and clear. I thought about my grandfather's office, the coffee, the manila folder, the Saturday morning in October when everything had been set in motion by a handshake and a sentence. I need you to do this right. I need it done so it cannot be undone. I had done it right. It had not been undone. The day I opened Thomas Sullivan Law, I had hung one thing on the wall of my office, not a diploma, not a bar certificate, not the kind of professional credential that announces itself. A photograph. My grandfather and me, taken on the back porch of the Hamptons house the summer I turned 28, both of us looking at something off to the left of the frame that I could no longer remember. He was laughing. I was laughing. Every client who came into my office saw it. A few had asked about it. I told them it was my grandfather. I told them he had built something worth protecting. I told them that was what we were going to do for them. That was what we were always going to do. There is something I want to say before you go. I spent 32 years being the quiet one, the responsible one, the one who showed up and helped carry the food to the car and drove home alone and did not make a scene. I spent 3 years holding a document in a file folder in a law office in Hartford and saying nothing, waiting, watching. People sometimes ask me if I regret waiting so long, if I wish I had acted sooner, said something earlier, forced a different ending before things went as far as they went. I don't. My grandfather told me to let them show me who they were first. And they did. Every phone call, every email, every sentence constructed in front of witnesses to establish a narrative. They showed me, clearly and completely, exactly who they were. And because they did, there was nothing ambiguous about what came after. There was no room for anyone to say it had been misunderstood. If you are watching this and you have been the quiet one, the one who shows up and asks for nothing and gets written off anyway, I want you to hear this. Your silence is not weakness. Your patience is not agreement. And the ground you are standing on may be more solid than the people around you have any idea. Now what you have. Protect it properly. And wait. If you have ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to know you best, leave me a comment below. Tell me your story. I read every single one, and if this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something, please like this video and subscribe. There are more stories coming, stories about dignity and patience, and what happens when people finally have to reckon with what they thought they could take. I will see you in the next one.